The Tale by Joseph Conrad. Outside the large single window, the crepuscular light was dying out slowly in a great square gleam without colour, framed rigidly in the gathering shades of the room. It was a long room. The irresistible tide of the night ran into the most distant part of it, where the whispering of a man's voice, passionately interrupted and passionately renewed, seemed to plead against the answering murmurs of infinite sadness. At last, no answering murmur came. His movement when he rose slowly from his knees by the side of the deep, shadowy couch, holding the shadowy suggestion of a reclining woman, revealed him tall under the low ceiling, and sombre all over, except for the crude discord of the white collar under the shape of his head, and the faint, minute spark of a brass button here and there on his uniform. He stood over her a moment, masculine and mysterious in his immobility, before he sat down on a chair nearby. He could see only the faint oval of her upturned face, and, extended on her black dress, her pale hands, a moment before abandoned to his kisses, and now as if too weary to move. He dared not make a sound, shrinking as a man would do from the prosaic necessities of existence. As usual, it was the woman who had the courage. Her voice was heard first, almost conventional, while her being vibrated yet with conflicting emotions. "Tell me something," she said. The darkness hid his surprise and then his smile. Had he not just said to her everything worth saying in the world, and that not for the first time? "What am I to tell you?" he asked, in a voice creditably steady. He was beginning to feel grateful to her for that something final in her tone which had eased the strain. "Why not tell me a tale?" "A tale?" He was really amazed. "Yes, why not?" These words came with a slight petulance, the hint of a loved woman's capricious will, which is capricious only because it feels itself to be a law, embarrassing sometimes and always difficult to elude. "Why not?" he repeated with a slightly mocking accent, as though he had been asked to give her the moon. But now he was feeling a little angry with her for that feminine mobility that slips out of an emotion as easily as out of a splendid gown. He heard her say, a little unsteadily, with a sort of fluttering intonation which made him think suddenly of a butterfly's flight, "You used to tell your simple and professional tales very well at one time, or well enough to interest me. You had a sort of art in the days before the war." "Really?" he said, with involuntary gloom. "But now, you see, the war is going on," he continued, in such a dead, equable tone that she felt a slight chill fall over her shoulders. And yet she persisted, for there is nothing more unswerving in the world than a woman's caprice. "It could be a tale not of this world," she explained. "You want a tale of the better world?" he asked, with a matter-of-fact surprise. "You must evoke for that task those who have already gone there." No, I don't mean that. I mean some other world. In the universe, not in heaven." "I am relieved. But you forget that I have only 5 days' leave." "Yes, and I've also taken 5 days' leave from my duties." "I like that word." "What word?" "Duty." "It is horrible, sometimes." "Oh, that's because you think it's narrow. But it isn't. It contains infinites. And so..." What is this jargon?" He disregarded the interjected scorn. "An infinity of absolution, for instance," he continued. "But as to this another world, who's going to look for it and for the tale that is in it?" "You," she said, with a strange, almost rough sweetness of assertion. He made a shadowy movement of assent in his chair, the irony of which not even the gathered darkness could render mysterious. "As you will. In that world, then, there was once upon a time a commanding officer and a Northman. Put in the capitals, please, because they had no other names. It was a world of seas and continents and islands, like the earth," she murmured bitterly. "Yes. What else could you expect from sending a man made of our common, tormented clay on a voyage of discovery? What else could he find? What else could you understand or care for, or feel the existence of, even? There was comedy in it, and slaughter." "Always like the earth," she murmured. "Always. And since I could find in the universe only what was deeply rooted in the fibres of my being, there was love in it too. But we won't talk of that." "No, we won't," she said, in a neutral tone which concealed perfectly her relief or her disappointment. Then, after a pause, she added, "It's going to be a comic story." "Well..." He paused too. "Yes, in a way. In a very grim way. It will be human, and, as you know, comedy is but a matter of the visual angle. And it won't be a noisy story. All the long guns in it will be dumb as so many telescopes." "Ah, there are guns in it, then. And may I ask where?" "Afloat. You remember that the world of which we speak had its seas. A war was going on in it. It was a funny world, and terribly in earnest. Its war was being carried on over the land, over the water, under the water, up in the air, and even under the ground. And many young men in it, mostly in wardrooms and mess rooms, used to say to each other, pardon the unparliamentary word, they used to say, 'It's a damned bad war, but it's better than no war at all.' Sounds flippant, doesn't it?" He heard a nervous, impatient sigh in the depths of the couch while he went on without a pause. "And yet there is more in it than meets the eye. I mean more wisdom. Flippancy, like comedy, is but a matter of visual first impression. That world was not very wise, but there was in it a certain amount of common working sagacity. That, however, was mostly worked by the neutrals in diverse ways, public and private, which had to be watched by acute minds and also by actual sharp eyes. They had to be very sharp indeed, too, I assure you." "I can imagine," she murmured appreciatively. "What is there that you can't imagine?" he pronounced soberly. "You have the world in you. But let us go back to our commanding officer, who, of course, commanded a ship of a sort. My tales, if often professional, as you remarked just now, have never been technical. So I'll just tell you that the ship was of a very ornamental sort once, with lots of grace and elegance and luxury about her. Yes, once. She was like a pretty woman who had suddenly put on a suit of sackcloth and stuck revolvers in her belt. But she floated lightly, she moved nimbly, she was quite good enough." "That was the opinion of the commanding officer?" said the voice from the couch. "It was. He used to be sent out with her along certain coasts to see, what he could see. Just that. And sometimes he had some preliminary information to help him, and sometimes he had not. And it was all one, really. It was about as useful as information trying to convey the locality and intentions of a cloud, of a phantom taking shape here and there and impossible to seize would have been. It was in the early days of the war. What at first used to amaze the commanding officer was the unchanged face of the waters, with its familiar expression, neither more friendly nor more hostile. On fine days the sun strikes sparks upon the blue. Here and there a peaceful smudge of smoke hangs in the distance, and it is impossible to believe that the familiar clear horizon traces the limit of one great circular ambush. Yes, it is impossible to believe, till some day you see a ship, not your own ship that isn't so impressive, but some ship in company, blow up all of a sudden and plop under almost before you know what has happened to her. Then you begin to believe. Henceforth you go out for the work to see what you can see, and you keep on at it with the conviction that someday you will die from something you have not seen. One envies the soldiers at the end of the day, wiping the sweat and blood from their faces, counting the dead fallen to their hands, looking at the devastated fields, the torn earth that seems to suffer and bleed with them. One does, really. The final brutality of it, the taste of primitive passion, the ferocious frankness of the blow struck with one's hand, the direct call and the straight response. Well, the sea gave you nothing of that, and seemed to pretend that there was nothing the matter with the world. She interrupted, stirring a little. Oh, yes, sincerity, frankness, passion, 3 words of your gospel. Don't I know them? Think, isn't it ours, believed in common? He asked anxiously, yet without expecting an answer, and went on at once. Such were the feelings of the commanding officer. When the night came trailing over the sea, hiding what looked like the hypocrisy of an old friend, it was a relief. The night blinds you, frankly, and there are circumstances where the sunlight may grow as odious to one as falsehood itself. Night is all right. At night the commanding officer could let his thoughts get away. I won't tell you where. Somewhere where there was no choice but between truth and death. But thick weather, though it blinded one, brought no such relief. Mist is deceitful. The dead luminosity of the fog is irritating. It seems that you ought to see. One gloomy, nasty day, the ship was steaming along her beat in sight of a rocky, dangerous coast that stood out intensely black like an India ink drawing on grey paper. Presently the second in command spoke to his chief. He thought he saw something on the water, to seaward. Small wreckage, perhaps. But there shouldn't be any wreckage here, sir, he remarked. No, said the commanding officer. The last reported submarine ships were sunk a long way to the westward. But one never knows. There may have been others since then not reported nor seen, gone with all hands. That was how it began. The ship's course was altered to pass the object close, for it was necessary to have a good look at what one could see. Close, but without touching, for it was not advisable to come in contact with objects of any form whatever floating casually about. Close, but without stopping or even diminishing speed, for in those times it was not prudent to linger on any particular spot, even for a moment. I may tell you at once that the object was not dangerous in itself. No use in describing it. It may have been nothing more remarkable than, say, a barrel of certain shape and colour, but it was significant. The smooth bow wave hove it up as if for a closer inspection, and then the ship, brought again to her course, turned her back on it with indifference, while 20 pairs of eyes on her deck stared in all directions, trying to see what they could see. The commanding officer and his second-in-command discussed the object with understanding. It appeared to them to be not so much a proof of the sagacity as of the activity of certain neutrals. This activity had in many cases taken the form of replenishing the stores of certain submarines at sea. This was generally believed, if not absolutely known. But the very nature of things in those early days pointed that way. The object, looked at closely and turned away from with apparent indifference, put it beyond doubt that something of the sort had been done somewhere in the neighbourhood. The object in itself was more than suspect, but the fact of its being left in evidence roused other suspicions. Was it the result of some deep and devilish purpose? As to that, all speculation soon appeared to be a vain thing. Finally, the two officers came to the conclusion that it was left there most likely by accident, complicated possibly by some unforeseen necessity, such, perhaps, as the sudden need to get away quickly from the spot, or something of that kind. Their discussion had been carried on in curt, weighty phrases, separated by long, thoughtful silences. And all the time their eyes roamed about the horizon in an everlasting, almost mechanical effort of vigilance. The younger man summed up grimly, "Well, it's evidence. That's what this is. Evidence of what we were pretty certain of before. And plain, too." "And much good it will do to us," retorted the commanding officer. "The parties are miles away. The submarine, devil only knows where, ready to kill, and the noble neutral slipping away to the eastward, ready to lie." The second-in-command laughed a little at the tone, but he guessed that the neutral wouldn't even have to lie very much. Fellows like that, unless caught in the very act, felt themselves pretty safe. They could afford to chuckle. That fellow was probably chuckling to himself. It's very possible he had been before at the game, and didn't care a rap for the bit of evidence left behind. It was a game in which practice made one bold and successful, too. And again he laughed faintly. But his commanding officer was in revolt against the murderous stealthiness of methods and the atrocious callousness of complicities that seemed to taint the very source of men's deep emotions and noblest activities, to corrupt their imagination which builds up the final conceptions of life and death. He suffered... The voice from the sofa interrupted the narrator. "How well I can understand that in him." He bent forward slightly. "Yes, I too. Everything should be open in love and war. Open as the day, since both are the call of an ideal which it is so easy, so terribly easy to degrade in the name of victory." He paused, then went on. "I don't know that the commanding officer delved so deep as that into his feelings, but he did suffer from them, a sort of disenchanted sadness. It is possible, even, that he suspected himself of folly. Man is various. But he had no time for much introspection, because from the southwest a wall of fog had advanced upon his ship. Great convolutions of vapours flew over, swirling about masts and funnel, which looked as if they were beginning to melt. Then they vanished. The ship was stopped. All sounds ceased, and the very fog became motionless, growing denser and as if solid in its amazing dumb immobility. The men at their stations lost sight of each other. Footsteps sounded stealthy. Rare voices, impersonal and remote, died out without resonance. A blind, white stillness took possession of the world. It looked, too, as if it would last for days. I don't mean to say that the fog did not vary a little in its density. Now and then it would thin out mysteriously, revealing to the men a more or less ghostly presentiment of their ship. Several times the shadow of the coast itself swam darkly before their eyes through the fluctuating opaque brightness of the great white cloud clinging to the water. Taking advantage of these moments, the ship had been moved cautiously nearer the shore. It was useless to remain out in such thick weather. Her officers knew every nook and cranny of the coast along their beat. They thought that she would be much better in a certain cove. It wasn't a large place, just ample room for a ship to swing at her anchor. She would have an easier time of it till the fog lifted up. Slowly, with infinite caution and patience, they crept closer and closer, seeing no more of the cliffs than an evanescent dark loom with a narrow border of angry foam at its foot. At the moment of anchoring, the fog was so thick that for all they could see they might have been 1,000 miles out in the open sea. Yet the shelter of the land could be felt. There was a peculiar quality in the stillness of the air. Very faint, very elusive, the wash of the ripple against the encircling land reached their ears, with mysterious, sudden pauses. The anchor dropped. The leads were laid in. The commanding officer went below into his cabin. But he had not been there very long when a voice outside his door requested his presence on deck. He thought to himself, "What is it now?" He felt some impatience at being called out again to face the wearisome fog. He found that it had thinned again a little, and had taken on a gloomy hue from the dark cliffs which had no form, no outline, but asserted themselves as a curtain of shadows all round the ship, except in one bright spot, which was the entrance from the open sea. Several officers were looking that way from the bridge. The second in command met him with the breathlessly whispered information that there was another ship in the cove. She had been made out by several pairs of eyes only a couple of minutes before. She was lying at anchor very near the entrance, a mere vague blot on the fog's brightness. And the commanding officer, by staring in the direction pointed out to him by eager hands, ended by distinguishing it, at last, himself. Indubitably a vessel of some sort. "It's a wonder we didn't run slap into her when coming in," observed the second in command. "Send a boat on board before she vanishes," said the commanding officer. He surmised that this was a coaster. It could hardly be anything else. But another thought came into his head suddenly. "It is a wonder," he said to his second in command, who had rejoined him after sending the boat away. By that time, both of them had been struck by the fact that the ship so suddenly discovered had not manifested her presence by ringing her bell. "We came in very quietly, that's true," concluded the younger officer, "but they must have heard our leadsman at least. We couldn't have passed her more than 50 yards off. The closest shave. They may even have made us out, since they were aware of something coming in. And the strange thing is that we never heard a sound from her. The fellows on board must have been holding their breath." "Aye," said the commanding officer thoughtfully. In due course the boarding boat returned, appearing suddenly alongside, as though she had burrowed her way under the fog. The officer in charge came up to make his report, but the commanding officer didn't give him time to begin. He cried from a distance, "Coaster, isn't she?" "No, sir. A stranger. A neutral," was the answer. "No. Really? Well, tell us all about it. What is she doing here?" The young man stated that he had been told a long and complicated story of engine troubles, but it was plausible enough from a strictly professional point of view, and it had the usual features: disablement, dangerous drifting along the shore, weather more or less thick for days, fear of a gale, ultimately a resolve to go in and anchor anywhere on the coast, and so on. Fairly plausible. "Engines still disabled?" inquired the commanding officer. "No, sir, she has steam on them." The commanding officer took his second aside. "By Jove," he said, "you were right. They were holding their breaths as we passed them. They were." But the second in command had his doubts now. "A fog like this does muffle small sounds, sir," he remarked. "And what could his object be, after all?" "To sneak out unnoticed," answered the commanding officer. "Then why didn't he? He might have done it, you know. Not exactly unnoticed, perhaps. I don't suppose he could have slipped his cable without making some noise. Still, in a minute or so he would have been lost to view, clean gone before we had made him out fairly. Yet he didn't." They looked at each other. The commanding officer shook his head. Such suspicions as the one which had entered his head are not defended easily. He did not even state it openly. The boarding officer finished his report. The cargo of the ship was of a harmless and useful character. She was bound to an English port, papers and everything in perfect order. Nothing suspicious to be detected anywhere. Then, passing to the men, he reported the crew on deck and as the usual lot, engineers of the well-known type, and very full of their achievement in repairing the engines. The mate, surly. The master, rather a fine specimen of a Northman, civil enough, but appeared to have been drinking. Seemed to be recovering from a regular bout of it. I told him I couldn't give him permission to proceed. He said he wouldn't dare to move his ship her own length out in such weather as this, permission or no permission. I left a man on board, though. Quite right. The commanding officer, after communing with his suspicions for a time, called his second aside. What if she were the very ship which had been feeding some infernal submarine or other? He said in an undertone. The other started. Then, with conviction, "She would get off scot-free. You couldn't prove it, sir." "I want to look into it myself." "From the report we've heard, I am afraid you couldn't even make a case for reasonable suspicion, sir." "I'll go on board all the same." He had made up his mind. Curiosity is the great motive power of hatred and love. What did he expect to find? He could not have told anybody, not even himself. What he really expected to find there was the atmosphere of gratuitous treachery, which in his view nothing could excuse. For he thought that even a passion of uprighteousness for its own sake could not excuse that. But could he detect it, sniff it, taste it, receive some mysterious communication which would turn his invisible suspicions into a certitude strong enough to provoke action with all its risks? The master met him on the aft deck, looming up in the fog amongst the blurred shapes of the usual ship's fittings. He was a robust Northman, bearded and in the force of his age. A round leather cap fitted his head closely. His hands were rammed deep into the pockets of his short leather jacket. He kept them there while he explained that at sea he lived in the chart room and led the way there, striding carelessly. Just before reaching the door under the bridge, he staggered a little, recovered himself, flung it open and stood aside, leaning his shoulder as if involuntarily against the side of the house, and staring vaguely into the fog-filled space. But he followed the commanding officer at once, flung the door to, snapped on the electric light, and hastened to thrust his hands back into his pockets, as though afraid of being seized by them either in friendship or in hostility. The place was stuffy and hot. The usual chart rack overhead was full, and the chart on the table was kept unrolled by an empty cup standing on a saucer half full of some spilt dark liquid. A slightly nibbled biscuit reposed on the chronometer case. There were 2 settees, and one of them had been made up into a bed with a pillow and some blankets, which were now very much tumbled. The Northman let himself fall on it, his hands still in his pockets. "Well, here I am," he said, with a curious air of being surprised at the sound of his own voice. The commanding officer from the other settee observed the handsome, flushed face. Drops of fog hung on the yellow beard and moustaches of the Northman. The much darker eyebrows ran together in a puzzled frown, and suddenly he jumped up. "What I mean is, I don't know where I am. I really don't," he burst out with extreme earnestness. "Hang it all! I got turned around somehow. The fog has been after me for a week. More than a week. And then my engines broke down. I will tell you how it was." He burst out into loquacity. It was not hurried, but it was insistent. It was not continuous for all that. It was broken by the most queer, thoughtful pauses. Each of these pauses lasted no more than a couple of seconds, and each had the profundity of an endless meditation. When he began again, nothing betrayed in him the slightest consciousness of these intervals. There was the same fixed glance, the same unchanged earnestness of tone. He didn't know. Indeed, more than one of these pauses occurred in the middle of a sentence. The commanding officer listened to the tale. It struck him as more plausible than simple truth is in the habit of being. But that, perhaps, was prejudice. All the time the Northman was speaking, the commanding officer had been aware of an inward voice, a grave murmur in the depth of his very own self, telling another tale, as if on purpose to keep alive in him his indignation and his anger with that baseness of greed or of mere outlook which lies often at the root of simple ideas. It was the story that had already been told to the boarding officer an hour or so before. The commanding officer nodded slightly at the Northman from time to time. The latter came to an end and turned his eyes away. He added as an afterthought, "Wasn't it enough to drive a man out of his mind with worry? And it's my first voyage to this part too, and the ship's my own. Your officer has seen the papers. She isn't much, as you can see for yourself, but just an old cargo boat, bare living for my family." He raised a big arm to point at a row of photographs plastering the bulkhead. The movement was ponderous, as if the arm had been made of lead. The commanding officer said carelessly, "You will be making a fortune yet for your family with this old ship." "Yes, if I don't lose her," said the Northman gloomily. "I mean out of this war," added the commanding officer. The Northman stared at him in a curiously unseeing and at the same time interested manner, as only eyes of a particular blue shade can stare. "And you wouldn't be angry at it," he said, "would you? You are too much of a gentleman. We didn't bring this on you. And suppose we sat down and cried, what good would that be? Let those cry who made the trouble," he concluded with energy. "Time's money, you say? Well, this time is money. Oh, isn't it?" The commanding officer tried to keep under the feeling of immense disgust. He said to himself that it was unreasonable. Men were like that, moral cannibals feeding on each other's misfortunes. He said aloud, "You have made it perfectly plain how it is that you are here. Your logbook confirms you very minutely. Of course, a logbook may be cooked. Nothing easier." The Northman never moved a muscle. He was gazing at the floor. He seemed not to have heard. He raised his head after a while. "But you can't suspect me of anything," he muttered negligently. The commanding officer thought, why should he say this? Immediately afterwards, the man before him added, "My cargo is for an English port." His voice had turned husky for the moment. The commanding officer reflected, "That's true. There can be nothing I can't suspect him." Yet why was he lying with steam up in this fog? And then, hearing us come in, why didn't he give some sign of life? Why? Could it be anything else but a guilty conscience? He could tell by the leadsman that this was a man of war. Yes, why? The commanding officer went on thinking. Suppose I ask him and then watch his face. He will betray himself in some way. It's perfectly plain that the fellow has been drinking. Yes, he has been drinking, but he will have a lie ready all the same. The commanding officer was one of those men who are made morally and almost physically uncomfortable by the mere thought of having to beat down a lie. He shrank from the act in scorn and disgust, which were invincible because more temperamental than moral. So he went out on deck instead and had the crew mustered formally for his inspection. He found them very much what the report of the boarding officer had led him to expect. And from their answers to his questions he could discover no flaw in the logbook story. He dismissed them. His impression of them was a picked lot, have been promised a fistful of money each if this came off, all slightly anxious but not frightened. Not a single one of them likely to give the show away. They don't feel in danger of their life. They know England and English ways too well. He felt alarmed at catching himself thinking as if his vaguest suspicions were turning into a certitude. For, indeed, there was no shadow of reason for his inferences. There was nothing to give away. He returned to the chart room. The Northman had lingered behind there, and something subtly different in his bearing, more bold in his blue, glassy stare, induced the commanding officer to conclude that the fellow had snatched at the opportunity to take another swig at the bottle he must have had concealed somewhere. He noticed, too, that the Northman, on meeting his eyes, put on an elaborately surprised expression. At least, it seemed elaborated. Nothing could be trusted. And the Englishman felt himself, with astonishing conviction, faced by an enormous lie, solid like a wall, with no way round to get at the truth, whose ugly, murderous face he seemed to see peeping over at him with a cynical grin. "I dare say," he began suddenly, "you are wondering at my proceedings, though I am not detaining you, am I? You wouldn't dare to move in this fog." "I don't know where I am," the Northman burst out earnestly. "I really don't." He looked around as if the very chart-room fittings were strange to him. The commanding officer asked him whether he had not seen any unusual objects floating about while he was at sea. "Objects? What objects? We were groping blind in the fog for days." "We had a few clear intervals," said the commanding officer, "and I'll tell you what we have seen and the conclusion I've come to about it." He told him in a few words. He heard the sound of a sharp breath indrawn through closed teeth. The Northman, with his hand on the table, stood absolutely motionless and dumb. He stood as if thunderstruck. Then he produced a fatuous smile. Or at least, so it appeared to the commanding officer. Was this significant, or of no meaning whatever? He didn't know. He couldn't tell. All the truth had departed out of the world as if drawn in, absorbed in this monstrous villainy this man was, or was not, guilty of. Shooting's too good for people that conceive neutrality in this pretty way, remarked the commanding officer, after a silence. Yes, the Northman assented hurriedly, then added an unexpected and dreamy voiced, perhaps. Was he pretending to be drunk, or only trying to appear sober? His glance was straight, but it was somewhat glazed. His lips outlined themselves firmly out under his yellow moustache, but they twitched. Did they twitch? And why was he drooping like this in this attitude? There's no perhaps about it, pronounced the commanding officer sternly. The Northman had straightened himself, and unexpectedly he looked stern too. No, but what about the tempters? Better kill that lot off. There's about 4, 5, 6 million of them, he said grimly, but in a moment changed into a whining key. But I had better hold my tongue. You have some suspicions. No, I've no suspicions, declared the commanding officer. He never faltered. At that moment he had the certitude. The air of the chart room was thick with guilt and falsehood, braving the discovery, defying simple right, common decency, all humanity of feeling, every scruple of conduct. The Northman drew a long breath. Well, we know that you English are gentlemen, but let us speak the truth. Why should we love you so very much? You haven't done anything to be loved. We don't love the other people, of course. They haven't done anything for that either. A fellow comes along with a bag of gold. I haven't been in Rotterdam my last voyage for nothing. You may be able to tell something interesting, then, to our people when you come into port, interjected the officer. I might. But you keep some people in your pay at Rotterdam. Let them report. I am a neutral, am I not? Have you ever seen a poor man on one side and a bag of gold on the other? Of course I couldn't be tempted. I haven't the nerve for it. Really, I haven't. It's nothing to me. I'm just talking openly for once. Yes, and I am listening to you, said the commanding officer quietly. The Northman leaned forward over the table. Now that I know you have no suspicions, I talk. You don't know what a poor man is. I do. I do. I am poor myself. This old ship, she isn't much, and she is mortgaged too. Bare living, no more. Of course I wouldn't have the nerve, but a man who has nerve. See, the stuff he takes aboard looks like any other cargo. Packages, barrels, tins, copper tubes, whatnot. He doesn't see it work. It isn't real to him, but he sees the gold. That's real. Of course, nothing could induce me. I suffer from an internal disease. I would either go crazy from anxiety or take to drink or something. The risk is too great. Why, ruin. It should be death. The commanding officer got up after this curt declaration, which the other received with a hard stare, oddly combined with an uncertain smile. The officer's gorge rose at the atmosphere of murderous complicity which surrounded him, denser, more impenetrable, more acrid than the fog outside. It's nothing to me, murmured the Northman, swaying visibly. Of course not, assented the commanding officer, with a great effort to keep his voice calm and low. The certitude was strong within him. But I'm going to clear all you fellows off this coast at once, and I will begin with you. You must leave in half an hour. By that time the officer was walking along the deck with the Northman at his elbow. What? In this fog? The latter cried out huskily. Yes, You will have to go in this fog." "But I don't know where I am. I really don't." The commanding officer turned round. A sort of fury possessed him. The eyes of the two men met. Those of the Northman expressed a profound amazement. "Oh, you don't know how to get out?" The commanding officer spoke with composure, but his heart was beating with anger and dread. "I will give you your course. Steer south by east, half east, for about 4 miles, and then you will be clear to haul to the eastward for your port. The weather will clear up before very long." "Must I? What could induce me? I haven't the nerve." "And yet you must go, unless you want to—" "I don't want to," panted the Northman. "I've enough of it." The commanding officer got over the side. The Northman remained still, as if rooted to the deck. Before his boat reached his ship, the commanding officer heard the steamer beginning to pick up her anchor. Then, shadowy in the fog, she steamed out on the given course. "Yes," he said to his officers. "I let him go." The narrator bent forward towards the couch, where no movement betrayed the presence of a living person. "Listen," he said forcibly. "That course would lead the Northman straight on a deadly ledge of rock. And the commanding officer gave it to him. He steamed out, ran on it, and went down. So he had spoken the truth. He did not know where he was. But it proves nothing. Nothing either way. It may have been the only truth in all his story. And yet, he seems to have been driven out by a menacing stare. Nothing more." He abandoned all pretense. "Yes, I gave that course to him. It seemed to me a supreme test. I believe— No, I don't believe. I don't know. At the time I was certain. They all went down, and I don't know whether I have done stern retribution or murder, whether I have added to the corpses that litter the bed of the unreadable sea the bodies of men completely innocent or basely guilty. I don't know. I shall never know." He rose. The woman on the couch got up and threw her arms around his neck. Her eyes put 2 gleams in the deep shadow of the room. She knew his passion for truth, his horror of deceit, his humanity. "Oh, my poor, poor—" "I shall never know," he repeated sternly, disengaged himself, pressed her hands to his lips, and went out. The end. I like that one. Just an interesting sort of exploration of how far you can convince yourself that people are lying, basically. And I suppose in war, it's it's just the amount of stress that you're under, and the amount of fear and suspicion and everything that's around. It's all too easy to read the wrong signals and apparently send an entire ship of men to their deaths. Woo! Well, on that very cheerful note, I'm going to send you all to a break. So go do break-related things, and we will see you back in about 5 minutes. Bye for now. And we're back. Welcome back. Hope you've had a good break. Hope you have done break-related things. I just filled up my water. And yeah. I'm probably just gonna just take a second to find my page. We've just got 2 stories tonight, but it should, I imagine, take us to time. But yes, hope everybody is still doing well, and having a nice chill time. That's what we like. We like nice chill times. Also, did I miss? Oopsie. Did I miss a sub? I think I may have done. Who did I miss a sub from? An anonymous gifter gave Majestic Salad a sub. Thank you very much, anonymous gifter. That's very, very kind of you. And I hope you enjoy the sub, Salad. You now have fun emotes. Like these ones. Woo! I'm just gonna spam them. There you go. Emotes! Sublime. I think Sublime is possibly my favourite one. Just because, you know, gotta love our boy Billy Topaz. Anyway, let's continue with our second story for tonight. The Yacht by Arnold Bennett. When Mrs. Alice Thorpe, with her black Pomeranian, arrived at the Hard from the railway station, she at once picked out a small motor launch among the boats that were bobbing about the steps, and said, "Is this Mr. Thorpe's?" "Yes'm," said the sailor in charge of the launch. She signalled to a lad who lingered in the rear with her valise perched on his head. The valise was dropped into the forward part of the launch. Mrs. Thorpe gave the boy 6pence and placed herself and dog neatly in the stern sheets. The engines suddenly began to fire and throb with great velocity and noise, and the launch threaded out from the concourse of craft into the middle of the creek, leaving a wake of boiling foam. There had been no delay, no misunderstanding, no bungling, no slip. The telegraphic arrangements for taking Mrs. Thorpe on board the yacht had worked to perfection. Efficiency reigned. Aged 27, slim, not tall, Alice was a capable woman. Her eyes had the capable look which many men dislike, for while they appreciate the conveniences of efficiency in a girl, they seem to prefer the efficiency to be modestly masked by an appearance of helplessness. Alice neither disguised nor flaunted the fact that she was capable. Her eyes had also the look of one accustomed to give orders that were obeyed. The dog was supposed to be the only Pomeranian on earth not given to habitual yapping. Alice had purged it of the hereditary Pomeranian curse by replying instantly to every yap with a sound smack on the head. She adored the dog, which was passionately and exclusively devoted to her, after the manner of Pomeranian ladies to their mistresses. This Pomeranian's mistress, if not beautiful, was attractive, especially in figure and in clothes. She was a fine dancer, with a body that always surprised her partners by its extraordinary yieldingness, responsiveness, and flexibility. A man having danced with her for the first time would remember her physical elasticity for days, to say nothing of her sudden eager smiles that puckered all the skin round her eyes. "Which is the yacht?" asked Alice of the sailor. He was tidily dressed, but had an untidy mop of red hair escaping from his white cap, and a shapeless, ugly face, and his manner was somewhat gruff. She knew that he must be Peter, the steward and handyman, her husband's favourite, more than once referred to with laudation in her husband's letters. She did not care for him, and had already decided that he did not care for her. But she smiled amiably. Her's lying at the mouth of the creek in the river," said Peter, pointing. "That's her, that ketch with the blue ensign at the mizzen." Alice looked in vain along the vista of yachts and other craft in the creek. She did not know what a mizzen was, nor that the blue ensign was a flag. She fancied, indeed, that an ensign was a sort of three-cornered thing. Peter's incomprehensible indication, however, merely increased her sense of mystery and expectancy. The moment was thrilling for her. She had met her husband when both of them were in uniform in France. She had married him in London impulsively because they were so mad for each other. A week later he had been tragically swept off to Mesopotamia. Then, having got out of uniform, she had become organising secretary to a political body and had to go to America on its business. During her absence, James Thorpe had received unexpected leave. But her tyrannous conscience would not allow her to depart from the United States until her work was done, and she exulted in her work. Some caprice of the political body ended it in an hour by cable. She had obtained a berth on a Liverpool-bound liner the very next day. She might have cabled the grand news to her husband, but she found somewhere in her mind a piquant pleasure in the notion of surprising him. She surprised him by a telegram from Liverpool. She knew that he was out of the army and in business. The unconventional wording of his reply to her telegram enchanted her, besides providing diversion for telegraph operators who are not easily diverted. He was yachting, alone. She remembered vaguely that he possessed a yacht, laid up for 5 years, and had spoken very enthusiastically of yachting. Of course, he had been for meeting her in London, but she would have none of it. "You shall receive me on your yacht," she had telegraphed. As she was an expert organiser, and he was an expert organiser, the arrangements following this decision of hers were easy enough. She was now afraid, and her fear was romantic and terrible. The creek was alarmingly short. The launch surged at an alarming speed through the dappled blue water. She had not seen her lover, who was incidentally her husband, for nearly 2 years. She knew him by his photographs, his handwriting, his turns of phrase, and the memory of his gestures and of the feel of his moustache, but did she know him? Would he prove on further acquaintance to be somebody quite other than the image established in her heart? The situation was acutely disconcerting as she approached it. She stroked the dog's silky hair, and the dog glanced up at her face. "That's her," said Peter to the composed and prim young lady opposite him, pointing again. She almost exclaimed, "It's a very small yacht, isn't it?" but restrained herself. The yacht's stem was pointing up creek. Stern. The yacht's stern was pointing up creek against the ebb tide. Peter seemed to steer the launch very queerly. He was apparently passing the yacht. She caught sight of a name on a lifebuoy hung in the yacht's rigging. The name was Alice. "But I thought the yacht was called Hermes," she said. "Governor had her name changed last month," gloomily answered Peter, as it were with resentment. Peter was preoccupied with the manoeuvring of the launch on the tide, and Alice perceived that he knew exactly what he was doing. The nose of the launch edged towards the yacht's side. The launch seemed to hang in the current, then it slowly swung round, the propeller stopped, and the whole affair came gently to rest against dazzlingly white cushiony fenders and a polished stairway, from the top of which hung 2 dazzlingly white ropes. The yacht had grown enormous. Its bulwark rose high above the tiny launch, and it was solid and moveless as a rock. "And now he's called it Alice," said Alice to herself, and the situation appeared to be rather disconcerting. Chapter 2. Her husband loomed perpendicularly over her. "Hello," he cried, saluting. She answered in a weak voice. "Well?" Her face was burning. She seized the white ropes and tripped neatly up the stairway, and the blanched deck of the yacht stretched out firm and vast, and tall Jim clutched at her hand. "Come below and see the saloon," he murmured. He pushed her to a mahogany staircase under the main boom, and no sooner were they out of sight of the deck than he kissed her with rather more than his old accustomed violence. And the situation was acutely disconcerting again, but differently. There was a pattering of innumerable little feet on the staircase, and the dog, who under excitement produced in human ears the illusion that she was a centipede and not a quadruped, bounded into the saloon. "Oh, Fifi, I'd forgotten you. Jim, this is Fifi." The dog sprang into her arms, and Jim praised the dog highly and stroked her. Husband and wife sat side by side in the saloon and talked rather self-consciously about nothing, which was rather strange, seeing that each of them had 10,000 exciting matters to impart to the other. Still, it was all right. Alice knew it was all right, and she knew that Jim knew that it was all right. They were strangers in one way, and the most intimate of intimates in another. It might be said that the saloon held 4 people, not 2. "Oh, what's that funny thing?" Alice demanded, pointing to a very complicated kind of dial with a finger on it that was screwed face downwards to the saloon ceiling. "That? Oh, that's a compass so that I can see the course of the ship when I'm having my meals." "But the finger's moving right round." "Then you may be sure the yacht's moving right round too." "Then we are off already?" And Jim said in his stern, sardonic tone, "Didn't you hear the anchor being hauled up? Can't you feel the propeller?" The fact was that Alice had not noticed the loud clacking of the anchor chain, her powers of observation having been temporarily impaired by the surpassing interest of her own private sensations. As for the propeller, she had in a vague manner been aware of a general vibration, but had not attributed it to anything in particular. She did not even know that the yacht possessed a propeller. Jim took her by the shoulders, and they ran up on deck. The yacht was gliding out to sea, magically, formidably by its own secret force, for the sails were not yet set. The entire adventure was ecstatic, incredibly romantic. Alice had never been so happy, so troubled, so restless. "I do want to see all the rooms," said she, like a curious child. "You shall. Are you given to being seasick?" "I have never been seasick in my life," the capable woman replied with confidence. Jim's keen eyes wandered over her admiringly. "No," he murmured. "You aren't the sort that's seasick. You aren't." They descended again to the saloon. A beautiful tea, with real crockery and brilliant electroplate and real cakes and real cream, all set out upon a brass tray, lay on the table. Pete served the tea. Good. Will you pour out? You must. You're the mistress of this wigwam." She poured out. As she leaned an elbow on the table tipped downwards under the pressure of her arm. She gave a little squeal. All right, Jim reassured her grandly. "Pete's taken the pin out, you know. Leaves the table free to oscillate when the boat rolls. It's weighted with lead underneath, so it can't swing far." Oh, I see, of course," said Alice, who, however, was not completely reassured. Things were not, after all, quite what they seemed. She admired tremendously the internal arrangements of the yacht. They were so cosy, they were so complete, the most home-like thing she had ever seen. She visited every bit of the home. There was the saloon, or drawing-room, and there were a large double sleeping cabin and a small single one. Also, there was a tiny bathroom. The multiplicity of cupboards and drawers delighted her. Only in Utopia could she have imagined there could be so many cupboards and drawers. And there was electric light, and there were electric bells. You rang a bell, and it was answered just as it would have been in a real house, but much more promptly. Indeed, life on the yacht might be described as playing at perfect housekeeping. Everything had a place, and everything had to be in its place, and every place was full, except the drawers and the mirrored wardrobe reserved for the use of the mistress of the floating home. In the pantry, every cup was hung on a hook. Every wine-glass was lightly wedged in a fitting so that it could not dash itself against another wine-glass, and the same with saucers and plates. One surmised that even if the yacht were to turn upside down, nothing would break. And the organism was complete in itself, and sufficient to itself. Before dinner, Jim said, "Like a cocktail, beloved infant?" The notion of a cocktail appeared to her as something wild and wicked. "Why not?" said she, and Jim rang a bell. "2 cocktails, Pete." In about 2 minutes, Peter, in a white jacket, brought 2 cocktails out of the mysteries of the forecastle where the pantry was. If Jim had ordered 2 nectars, doubtless Pete would have produced them. The dinner was very sound. It was strictly plain: oxtail soup, tinned herring, roast mutton, potatoes, rice pudding, but it was sound. Alice admitted that Pete, for all his defects, could not merely cook meat well, he could buy good meat. But she pointed out to Jim that Pete did not know how to lay the table properly. The fellow had put the fish knife and fork within the meat knife and fork, and at Jim's suggestion she pointed out the sad lapse to Pete personally, with a bright smile. Pete received the correction with a tranquillity too perfect, indicating by his nonchalant demeanour that if it pleased Madam to have the meat knife and fork within the fish knife and fork, he had no objection to obliging her, but that for himself his soul was above trifles. Pete had been Jim's batman for nearly 3 years in the war, and Jim spoke with quiet enthusiasm of his qualities. Alice, however, did not quite see what that had to do with the knife and fork question. They went on deck. The yacht was now at anchor in another estuary, whose quiet waters were full of phosphorescence. A dinghy moving towards another yacht close by threw up marvellous silver fireworks at every stroke of the oars. The night was obscure and warm and incredible. A radiance came from the saloon's skylight, and a brighter radiance, sharply rectangular, from the open hatch of the forecastle. The crew, 4 human beings, could be heard talking in the depths of the forecastle. The old skipper appeared and made an inspection in the gloom, and Jim addressed him as skipper with affectionate respect, though he was naught but a fisherman in winter and spoke with a terrific Essex accent. The skipper disappeared. When next Alice glanced round, there was no radiance and no sound from the forecastle. The crew had gone to bed. She and Jim were alone in the vast and miraculous world, enveloped by the poetry of water and sky. Chapter 3. Nevertheless, the next morning in the double cabin, when she awoke very early in the twilight, that singular young woman was not utterly happy. That is to say, she was utterly happy, but at the same time she was unhappy. Her heart being a huge place where all kinds of contradictory emotions could roam in comfort without interfering with each other. Jim was not in his berth. Through the open skylight, across which a horizontal blue blind was drawn, she could hear him chatting with the skipper. Jim was disturbingly friendly with his crew. "Look lively with the tea, Pete," he cried out. "Very good, sir." In another minute she could hear him sipping tea in enormous sips. She had an impression that he was seated, in pyjamas and dressing gown, on the very skylight itself. The floating home, then, had already begun to function very perfectly for the day. It was precisely the perfect functioning of the organism that upset her. Every contrivance in it was a man's contrivance. Woman had naught to do with its excellence. It would function with the same perfection whether she happened to be there or not. It was orderly, it was comfortable, it was luxurious, and men had accomplished it and were maintaining it all by themselves. And the 5 males appeared to have an understanding among themselves, as if they belonged to a secret monastic or Masonic order. She was outside the understanding. She was a woman, ornamental, no doubt, but unnecessary. Well, she resented this in her great happiness. And she petted Fifi, who was curled within her arm, and Fifi resented it also. So that the next afternoon Alice had a headache. It was a genuine headache, of which the symptoms were genuine pain in the forehead and a general sense of impending calamity. Considering a headache to be the proper thing at this conjuncture, she had desired to have a headache, and she had a headache, for she was a capable and thoroughly efficient woman. Hence, with Fifi, she went and lay down in her bunk in the big cabin, and parted from Jim at the door thereof, telling him that she did not want him to tuck her up. She noticed that the general sense of impending calamity had already affected Jim's gaze, and she resented that. What justification had Jim to assume that all was not for the best on board of an ideal yacht, seeing that her behaviour towards him had been pluperfect? He had no justification. Therefore, he was in the wrong. In her happiness, she gave herself up to unhappiness. And yet her second marriage, it must be deemed her second marriage to Jim, the first having been an experiment, a prelude, an overture to the authentic union, her second marriage was unquestionably a success. She was mad about him. He was mad about her. She admired his character. He admired hers. She knew that he was the man for her and she the woman for him. Nothing could have been more propitious, more delicious, more exciting, more solidly sure. But she gave herself up to unhappiness because she felt herself unnecessary to the smooth working of the material organism in which she lived, and also because she felt herself to be outside the monastic or Masonic order of 5 mutually comprehending males. And here was the self-same woman who had commanded hundreds of fellow creatures in France, saying to them go, and they went, and come, and they came, and who had positively frightened a British political body and startled bigwigs in New York by the calm, unsentimental power of her horse sense. Most of the persons with whom she had come into contact would have been ready to assert that where a woman's heart usually is, she carried a bundle of pure sagacity, and none would have admitted that she could be subject to fancies. If those people whose respect she had extorted could have seen the charming little creature as she lay, all wires and springs and nerves in the bunk, and if they could have looked inside her head. Marriage is a most mysterious developer. The worst of it was that Fifi encouraged Alice in her morbidity. Fifi understood. She did not argue. She did not even yap. But the glance of her eyes was a plain statement of the thesis, "You are always right, and when the created universe is out of tune with you, the created universe needs altering." Then Alice became aware of a vibration, which increased until it affected the entire ship, the bunk, the water glass, the skylight, the pillow, the mattress, her toes, her temples. The propeller was propelling. Never before had the propeller been set to work while Alice was lying in her bunk. Why was the propeller now propelling? The weather was magnificent. The sun slanted into the cabin. The water was calm. Did not everybody know that she had a headache and was trying to rest? It was an outrage that the propeller should be set to work in such circumstances. Soon the propeller was doing more than revolve behind the stern post of the yacht. It was revolving right inside her poor head. She could not and would not stand it. She rang the bell. A red head appeared in the doorway. "Come in," she said pettishly. But the red head, timid in spite of campaigns, would not come in. "Yes'm?" "Oh, please ask Mr. Thorpe to have that propeller stopped." Peter merely laughed, a sort of contemptuously amused grin, and shut the door. The propeller was not stopped. In 5 minutes, which seemed rather like a century, there was nothing else on earth for Alice save the propeller. It became the sole mundane phenomenon. It was revolving not only in her head, but in every part of her lithe and attractive body. It monopolised her attention, her intelligence, and her emotions. It had been going on from everlasting, and it would go on to everlasting. As a method of torture, it rivalled and surpassed the most devilish inventions at the Holy Office at Toledo. It was the very thing to manufacture lunatics. Why had not Jim had the propeller stopped? He owned the yacht. If you could not silence your own propeller, what point was there in owning a yacht? Enormous and inexplicable events were passing on deck. Bumps, thuds, sudden rushes of feet, shouts, bangs, rattlings, thunderings, clackings. But none of the 5 members of the monastic or Masonic order showed the least interest in Alice and her aching head. "Ah!" The door of the cabin opened. "Better?" asked Jim, standing by the side of her bunk. He was perspiring. "No," she said. "Tea time. Come and have tea on deck. Do you good." "No," she said. "Shall I bring it you here?" "No," she said. At that moment, the propeller stopped. "At last," breathed Alice sardonically and even bitterly. "If you've got a headache, it's the most horrible torment one can imagine. I rang for Peter hours ago and asked him to tell you to stop it." "I'm so sorry, my dove, but you see the propeller couldn't be stopped. We were going up the Blackwater against the ebb. And it's some ebb, believe me. Wind fell to nothing. If we'd stopped the propeller, we should certainly have drifted onto a mudbank. Blackwater's full of 'em, and stuck there till next tide. We might have heeled over and filled as the tide fell. Ticklish thing, a boat drawing 8 feet odd on a falling tide in a river like the Blackwater." "Well, I think someone might have told me. I'm quite capable of understanding, though perhaps you mayn't think it." Jim's eyes glittered. "My child, I never thought for a moment. Just so. And let me tell you, your Peter's extremely rude. When I asked him, do you know what he did? He just laughed. His horrid, sarcastic grin. And I'll thank you to speak to him about his manners to me." Jim did a surprising thing. He laughed, heartily. Well, of course it would strike Peter as comic, asking for the propeller to be stopped in a dead calm against an ebb tide in this old Blackwater. He laughed when he came on deck and told me. It appealed to his sense of humour. "And I suppose you all laughed," said Alice, sharply, in a loud tone. "You would." She raised herself too violently on one elbow, and her delightful, misguided head struck the ceiling above the bunk. "Awfully sorry, darling," said Jim very quietly. But whether he was sorry about Peter's enormity, or sorry merely about the detail of the head bumping, Alice could not decide. At any rate, the bumping of her head rendered her furious and, quaintly enough, quite cured the headache. "Peter is a fool!" she almost shouted. "Hush!" Jim murmured grimly and dangerously. And at the same time the skipper's voice was heard on deck. "Let out a couple more fathoms more chain, Charlie." Alice's brain grasped the great truth that if she could hear the skipper and crew could hear her, and the still greater truth that voice-raising in anger was impossible on that yacht without open scandal. She would have given about £10 for the privilege of one unrestrained scream. Jim whispered uncompromisingly, "Pete certainly isn't a fool. Also, he's a particular friend of mine." An awful silence descended upon the yacht, and in the silence the yacht's clock, placed over the saloon stairs, could be heard ticking with uncanny loudness. In the late afternoon and early evening, Alice ranged and raged about the vessel, chewing the cud of the discovery that there was no real privacy aboard. There was privacy from eyes, and plenty of it, but there was absolutely no privacy from ears if you raised your tone beyond a certain degree. She wanted to do that more than she wanted to do anything else in the world. She examined the dispositions of the yacht again and again, with no satisfactory result. It was 60 feet from end to end of its wonderful deck, and it was full of secret compartments, but it held no compartment in which a grand quarrel, row and upset could be comfortably conducted according to the rules of such encounters. As a honeymoon resort, the yacht was merely absurd. None but an idiot could have had the preposterous notion of honeymooning on a 50-ton yacht. Alice did not reflect upon the dangerous folly and the bad form and the gross inefficiency of making a scene on the 3rd day of your second honeymoon. She did not even reflect that man is held to be a reasoning animal. She reflected simply and exclusively upon her predicament, which was surely the most singular predicament that a bride had ever found herself in. But she did not disclose her thoughts. No, to external view she was a charming, capable, sensible little yachtswoman in an agreeable blue jumper and blue skirt, wandering to and fro and on the yacht, in and on the yacht, interesting herself in its construction and its life, and behaving to all the men with the delicatest feminine sweetness. To Jim she was acquiescence embodied. The irritation shown in the bunk had completely vanished. Night fell, and a red eye shone forth from the land. She learned that it indicated a jetty on an island which, in mid-Blackwater, was devoted to the reclamation of habitual drunkards. She was suddenly inspired. "Let's row ashore, shall we?" she suggested persuasively. "But the island's private, you know," said Jim. Here, referring to the affair of the propeller, she might have revolted and said angrily, "Of course you're against anything I want." Many women in her place would have said just that. But Alice was determined to be efficient, and so she said with increased persuasiveness, "Still, it would be a bit of a lark, wouldn't it?" Jim gave the order to lower the launch, and they were taken ashore, and the launch instructed to return in half an hour. Return in an hour. Half an hour would have sufficed for Alice's purposes, but the captain and 2 of the crew were also in the launch and had to go down river to fill 6 beakers with fresh water from a well in the vicinity, which job could scarcely be accomplished in less than an hour. Chapter 4. "Now," said Jim, "shall we take a stroll and look for reformed drunkards?" "I think we'll just stay where we are," Alice answered. "I must have an understanding with you." She spoke firmly but quietly. The desire to make a noise seemed to have left her, now that she was free to make a noise without making a scandal. Both inside and out, she was the self-possessed woman again, the model of efficiency and sagacity, not merely in appearance, but to her own secret judgment. "Certainly," said Jim, with calmness. "Let's understand." She was nettled because she thought she detected irony in his powerful, almost brutal masculine voice. "I've already told you that I think Peter ought to apologise to me. He hasn't apologised to me. Quite the contrary." "Ah," Jim answered. "I knew that was on your mind. You're an A1 actress, but I'm an A1 dramatic critic." And he proceeded, "And what's more, I've already told you that Pete's a friend of mine, and I don't like to hear my wife call my friends fools." She then burst out into one of the most voluptuous of human passions, over-righteous indignation. She didn't want any more to be self-possessed, efficient, sagacious, nor to be an exemplary wife, nor to teach a barbaric husband by the force of Christian example, nor to do any of the things that serious young wives very properly want to do. She just wanted to let herself go. And she did. The mysterious and terrible potion had been brewing for several hours. It now boiled over, surging magnificently upwards as a geyser shoots out of the ground. She was at last free of the captivity of the yacht. There was none to overhear, and no eye to see except the red eye on the jetty. "That's just like you," she cried. "That's just like you. You're ready to risk the whole of our married life in order to indulge your brutality. You once said you were a brute, and so you are. We've scarcely been 3 days together, and yet you're spoiling for a row. You think you can browbeat me, you and your crew? You can't. You've all done nothing but laugh at me since I went on board. Look how you all stood round and smiled condescendingly when I steered. And heaven knows I only took the helm because you asked me to. You're all as thick as thieves together, and I'm a nobody. I'm only a woman, a doll to be petted and laughed at. Do you imagine I wanted to steer your precious yacht? Indeed, no. Give me an Atlantic liner, that's what I say. Your crew can do what they like with you, and you're such a simpleton you can't see it. They flatter you, and you're so conceited you swallow it all. And shouldn't I just like to see the food bills for your precious yacht? Why, there's been as much meat cooked for us in Why, there's been as much meat cooked for us two in these 3 days as would keep a family for a fortnight. You pay your crew wages that include their food, and then instead of buying their own food, they live on ours. It's as plain as a pikestaff." In a short pause that followed, Jim said, "Don't let me interrupt you. Tell me when you've quite done, and then I'll make a short speech. But if you think I'm going to lose my temper, old woman, you're mistook." Alice resumed. "I said Peter was a fool. So he is. But he's also a lout, and what's worse, he's a thief. He steals your food." Then Jim, taken unawares, lost his temper. The battle was joined. A big steam tug passed slowly up the river, a noisy but a noble phenomenon in the night. They did not notice it. They noticed nothing except their own dim forms, pale faces and glinting eyes, heard nothing but their own voices and the crunching of their restless feet on the caked mud of the foreshore. The old earth was whirling round with incredible velocity amid uncounted millions of starry bodies, of which it was nearly the very least. The mystery of life was unfathomed. The structure of society was shaken and cracked. Tens and thousands of children were starving in Europe. Frightful problems presented themselves on every side for solution. The future of the world was dark with fantastic menaces, and the great beauty and wistfulness of nature were unimpaired by all these horrors. But Alice and Jim ignored everything save the gratification of their base and petty instincts. They were indeed a shocking couple. The moon rose, the solemn, lovely moon that was drawing incalculable volumes of water out of the ocean into the estuary of the Blackwater, and Alice snapped, "What I say I stick to. And I tell you another thing. All red-headed men are the same." A strange glow appeared on the yacht. They did not see it. Peter hailed faintly from the yacht. They did not hear him. They were indulging themselves after restraint. They had gone back to the Neolithic age after too much civilization. And the whole fracas was due to the fact that, on a small yacht, everybody can hear everything. The ignoble altercation was suddenly cut short by the grating of a boat's keel on the muddy shingle. Peter in the dinghy. "Yacht's afire, sir," Peter called grimly. So it was. They could see flames coiling like snakes about the region of the saloon hatch. Jim came back to civilization in an instant. "Well, why haven't you put it out, you fool, instead of coming here to tell me? Do you want the bally ship to be burnt to the water's edge?" "Can't find the extinguisher, sir. It's supposed to hang in the small cabin, but it isn't on its hook. And we've run out of water on account of Mrs. Bath's. Not as canvas buckets would be much good." "My dog!" cried Alice. "She'll be roasted alive." "I've brought her ashore," said Peter, pitching the animal out of the dinghy. "Ah!" Jim rushed to the boat's nose, shoved her back into the water and sprang aboard. "Pull like the devil." "Stop!" shouted Alice. "I know where the extinguisher is." She plunged, Fifi in her arms, into the dark water and was dragged into the dinghy. Not only had she transgressed the rules of the yacht by taking freshwater baths, but she had moved the pyrene extinguisher from its hook into a locker in order to get another hook for her dresses. The small cabin had been allotted to her for a retiring room, and her attire was all over it. Wonderful it was how one small valise could carry all she wore. She had taken things from the valise, and more things, in the manner of a conjurer taking drapers' shops, flower shops, and zoological gardens out of one small hat. Once aboard the vessel, she plunged devotedly through smoke into the bowels thereof, and ascended again with the extinguisher. In 3 minutes, the fire was out. It appeared that someone with a British sense of humour had thrown a piece of burning rope from the tug. The rope had dropped onto the saloon hatch. The roof of the said hatch was severely damaged, and the coat of the mainsail a little charred, but that was the limit of the catastrophe. Chapter 5. The yacht was speeding up the Blackwater in the moonlight towards Maldon. James Thorpe, with all the dark fire of his nature, having determined at once to hunt the flame-scattering tug and get the law of it. He was in possession of what he considered to be sound circumstantial evidence of the tug's guilt. James himself had taken the wheel. Alice reclined at his feet. Fifi reclined at Alice's feet. The captain and crew were forward. Alice was perfectly happy. She had never really been unhappy, and especially had she not been unhappy in her nervous outpouring of riotous temper. But now she was in a kind of bliss. A bliss which was heightened by certain pinpricks. These pinpricks came from the facts: 1, that she had upset the marvellous functioning of the ship by misplacing the fire extinguisher; 2, that she had upset the marvellous economy of the ship by using fresh water instead of salt water for her baths; and 3, that James, in his enormous magnanimity, had refrained from twitting her about these lapses. Magnanimity, there we go. She reflected that, owing to a pressure of patriotic and other business, she had not lost her temper for several years, and probably would not lose it again for several years. And at any rate to have lost it and safely found it so early in a marriage, and with such an agreeable result, was not a bad thing, for it had amounted to a desirable and successful experiment. Her powerful common sense told her that there was a process in marriage known as settling down, that this process had to be gone through by all couples, and that she and Jim were getting through it quickly and brightly. She knew that she need not apologise to Jim, and indeed that he would hate her for apologising to him. She apologised by a touch, a glance, a tone, and by sitting at his feet. Peter came aft to the little deck larder that was forward of the saloon skylight. "Pete? Sir? Don't buy any more meat tomorrow until you've spoken to the mistress about it." "No, sir." Pete departed. Jim lowered his face and murmured, "You know, you've got to admit that old Pete isn't a fool." Alice had already fully absorbed the truth that Peter was not a fool. A man who, placed as Peter was placed, had had the presence of mind to think of the dog and bring the dog to safety ashore, such a man could not possibly be a fool. As for being the other thing that she had called him, of course that was absurd, and she had not meant it. No, she fully admitted in the privacy of her mind that she had been hopelessly wrong to call Peter a fool. But what she murmured to Jim in reply was, "Why, you called him a fool. You called him a fool yourself." Jim pinched her arm cruelly, but she dared not cry out lest she should be overheard. Therefore she suffered in silence and enjoyed the suffering. The end.